Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the authority of Jesus in our continuing survey of the life of Christ. All four of the gospel accounts begin with a statement of the true identity of Jesus, telling us in the first chapter, and more often than not, in the very first verse, who is Jesus. For example, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 starts off the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then it goes on to take that Abraham theme and that David theme through a genealogy, and then we hear about the birth of Jesus. Mark's account starts off, chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then we jump right into the action. In Luke's account, it's not until we get to chapter 1, verse 35, so it's part of the story, and it is being told to Mary, where the angels appeared to her, and is telling her the Holy Child shall be called the Son of God. So we hear it in Luke's account by way of the narrative. In John's account, John starts off, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then we find out, when we get down to verse 14, that Word became flesh. So again, we're talking about Jesus. In Luke chapter 4, verse 16, we have the account of Jesus coming to his hometown, the town where he grew up, to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue. I'm showing here a restored synagogue built to what it would have looked like in Nazareth in the days of Jesus. Very, very small structure. And he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Remember, not everybody came with a Bible, so there would be stored in the synagogue a copies of various scrolls that made up their scriptures. And in this case, the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened the book and found the place where it was written. Notice Jesus knew how to read. He had been trained, as did most Jewish men of that day. And he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And at that point, our reading of the passage ends. Now, Jesus might have read further. Remember that we're always reading just a synopsis of any sermon, of any reading when we're reading a historical narrative. But the passage for us, Luke's quotation of the passage, ends here and does not include the rest of the sentence, which would have talked about the judgment of God, because Jesus didn't come in his first coming to bring judgment, and Luke is not going to emphasize that. And he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he began to say to them, and they were probably imagining that he would say, one of these days, the Spirit is going to come, or think about how the Spirit came in the past, maybe look to the future, look to the past. Instead, he focused their attention on the present. He began to say to them, today the Scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. You are seeing the fulfillment of that. And all were speaking well of him and wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips, and they were saying, "Is not this Joseph's son? Isn't this the one who grew up with us in Nazareth?" Now, we've just read about how they were all speaking graciously, speaking well of him, and that's going to change with the things that Jesus says next. And he said to them, this is verse 23, "No doubt you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Whatever we heard was done at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.'" In other words, they're saying, this is your hometown. We deserve something more than you were doing other places. We heard you were doing some great things there. Now, do something here, because we're your hometown. We deserve it. And he said to them, "Truly, I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his hometown." They're expecting great miracles because he had done big miracles in other places. They're expecting even greater things here. They're demanding greater things. He says, a prophet is not welcome in his hometown. "But I say to you in truth, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the land, and yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. When you look at the miracles that Elijah did, at the high point of his, I guess you could call his miracle capacity, the times when he was saying to the rain, don't rain on the land for 3.5 years. And then after that, he would call for the rain, and it would come in a flooding torrential downpour at his word. In all that time, there was only one miracle that Elijah did. Only one time did he go to a widow and feed her and raise her son from the dead. And that was not an Israelite widow, even though there were many Israelite widows around. That was a Canaanite, a Sidonian, a foreigner, a Gentile. And, second illustration, and there were many lepers in Israel at the time of Elisha. Notice we go from Elijah to Elisha, the prophet. And Elisha, again, did great miracles. And the only time he ever cured somebody of leprosy was, there was none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. Only this Gentile was healed of his leprosy. Out of all the Jews that could have been healed, only a Gentile was healed. The point is that God is not under obligation to give special blessings to the Jews. He is equally able to bless the Gentiles. And all the people in the synagogue, they hear this. And they get the point. And they're filled with rage as they heard these things. And they got up and drove him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill on which their city had been built in order to throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went his way. They're intending to put him to death for what they see as an ultimate insult against them. And instead, he passes through their midst. Was this a supernatural passing? We are not told. He just passed through their midst and he went his way. And that's the end of the situation. Now, next we read about the choosing of the 12. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all discuss this in similar terms. Matthew says Jesus summoned his 12 disciples, gave them authority. Notice the authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out, to heal every kind of disease, every kind of sickness. Mark 3:14 in the parallel passage says he appointed 12 so that they would be with him, that he could send them out to preach and have, notice again, authority to cast out the demons. Luke chapter 3 verse 13 does not use the term authority, but I think it's still there. When day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them. Notice a disciple is not an apostle, and he names these 12 apostles, and that's an authoritative word. That's a word signifying authority. In fact, in early Greek, in the Greek, a couple of hundred years before Jesus comes along, the term apostle, when it had been coined, it had been used to describe the admiral of the fleet. Now it's used in a much more general term, but it still has that idea of one sent out with authority. And in the listing of the apostles, and here they are in the grouping that they're listed, notice the order changes only slightly, and when it does change, in Matthew 10 versus Mark 3 versus Luke 6, they are still kept in certain groupings, so that I have Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Even though Mark says Simon, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, it's still the same people in the first group. I have what could be described as sort of an inner circle in these first four groupings. So whether it's Matthew or Mark or Luke, they all had the same names, a slightly different order, but essentially the same names of Peter and Andrew and James and John. And then I get to the second grouping, and again, the order is changed slightly. The question is, whether do you put Thomas before Matthew or Matthew before Thomas? But it's still the same four names: Philip and Bartholomew and Thomas and Matthew. And perhaps these were not the inner circle, but still in close proximity to Jesus. We have, in the case of all four of these, at different times, there are things that Jesus says to them and they say to Jesus, and we read about that in any one or more of the gospel accounts. We read about Philip and how he first brought Nathanael. We read about Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew. It's the same person, whether you call him Bartholomew, son of Ptolemy, or Nathanael. We have Thomas, We know him for his doubting, but we also know him for some other things that he says as well. And we have Matthew, the tax collector turned follower. And so we're given just a bit of information on all four of those. And then we get down to the last four. And in this case, again, the order is slightly changed. I have James, another James. It's a common name. Actually, the way you say it, you don't say James in Greek. You say Jacob, because it's when we say James, it's the anglicized form of Jacob. But James, or Jacob, and then Thaddeus, also known as Judas. Judas apparently was his real name. Thaddeus was his nickname. And then Simon. And in all three of these lists, the last name to be mentioned is Judas Iscariot, because he will be a significant player, not because he's so close, but because of what he does. He is the one who's going to betray Jesus. Well, Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, after they've been chosen, these 12 Jesus sent out, after instructing them, here are the instructions: do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter any city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They're not to go to the place of the Gentiles, even though Jesus at times went and ministered to Gentiles. They are not to do that. They're not going, even though Jesus had talked about going and, how at times past the prophets like Elijah and Elisha had gone and healed and been with people, a widow from Sidon, or a Naaman, the man from Aram. Roman name for that is Syria. But they're not to do that. They are instead going to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, that the good news might first go to the Jews and then later to the Gentiles. And as you go, Jesus says, preach. Here's the message, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The message hasn't changed. It is still the same message that we saw from the beginning. And with that message comes signs of authority. Here they are: heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you received, freely give. So that their ministry is both preaching and doing and serving. Do not acquire gold, he says, or silver, or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats, or sandals, or a staff. Why? Because the worker is worthy of his support. That is, you are to go and you are to be supported by those to whom you are ministering. That will set up a precedent for later spiritual leaders, for church leaders. This is why we pay our pastor a salary, because it's appropriate, because the worker is worthy of his support. And whatever city or village, Jesus says, you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay at his house until you leave that city. That is, you weren't to be going from house to house to house. Rather, just make a base of operations. And as you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the house is worthy, give it your blessing of peace. But if it is not worthy, take back your blessing of peace and go to some place that is worthy. Whoever does not receive you, nor heed your words, as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. That's a sign of judgment. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. And remember what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? It was not tolerable at all. Those are 2 cities that were destroyed. And it will be more tolerable for those in the day of judgment than for that city. There's a warning here that Jesus takes his servants seriously, and people who receive Jesus are going to be receiving his servants as well. Now, the specific nature of the instructions. First of all, I want you to notice that these instructions are given to a specific group of men. That I don't think that is saying that when missionaries go out today, that they should not raise funds or take along an extra change of clothes or preparation. No. These are specific instructions to a special group of men, and it is specific instructions for a limited time. These are given in a specific localized mission. They will go out, they will come back in a relatively brief period, and that will be the end of that particular assignment. It's not an ongoing thing. Today, we do go and send missionaries not just to the Jews, but to the Gentiles as well. So we're not under the same restriction that they had at that time. This mission will be superseded at a later date. At a later time, Jesus himself, in fact, Matthew, in the same gospel account, will record the teaching of Jesus, go out and make disciples of all the nations, not just the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so this is a particular, specific set of instructions for this particular, specific time. Now, next we're going to look at some of the controversies that Jesus has concerning the Sabbath. And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields. This is Mark chapter 2, verse 23 and 24. He was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. Now, they weren't stealing. You were allowed to do this. This was actually part of the law. You were allowed, if you passed through somebody's field, you were allowed to grab a handful of grain and sort of rub it in your hands and eat some of it. Now, you weren't allowed to come in with a basket. You weren't allowed to be reaping in his field, but this was considered just taking a bite. And the Pharisees saw this and were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful? Now, what they were doing was lawful, but on the Sabbath. What they were doing was considered to be the equivalent of sowing and reaping. Well, it wasn't really, but the Pharisees looked at it that way. And they said, wait a minute, you shouldn't be doing that on the Sabbath. You shouldn't be getting a snack on the Sabbath. You should wait, Monday through Friday or Saturday. Monday through Friday. Sunday was considered, a regular day for them as well. And not the Sabbath. And he, that is Jesus, said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and he also gave it to those who were with him. Now he's telling a story of what David did in the Old Testament, and apparently that story was looked upon by both religious leaders and rabbis and others, and even by Jesus, as something that was appropriate for David to do. David did some things that he shouldn't have done, but this wasn't one of those things. How David took in time of need that which was normally set aside for something special. And Jesus indicates he thinks that's okay. And not only does he think it's okay, it was considered to be okay even by the Jewish religious leaders. And Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. That's not to say you shouldn't keep the Sabbath, but it was made for your benefit. And if there's a special need, then go ahead and fill the need. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. He is our Lord, but he's also Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't over Jesus, rather he's over the Sabbath, and he gets to do with the Sabbath as he feels is appropriate. Incidentally, one of the ways this has worked out throughout church history is that Christians largely, not universally, but largely, have observed, instead of observing the seventh day, Saturday, they have observed the first day of the week, and this seems to have started all the way back in biblical times, because there's several references, even in the epistles and the book of Acts, to them meeting together on the first day of the week. And that's okay, because the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Now, he entered again into a synagogue. This is next story, but it's going to be another Sabbath story. Didn't necessarily happen the next week, but it's related to us, another Sabbath story. He entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they were watching him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. You see, the Jews had come to the conclusion that it's okay to save a life on the Sabbath, but if somebody's not in any physical danger of dying that day, then you ought to put it off until the next day. And so here's Jesus. He sees a need on the Sabbath, and they're ready to pounce. He said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. And He said to them, he now asked those who are thinking this, who are getting ready to pounce, who are getting ready to accuse him, he said to them, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? And the reason he asks it that way is back during the days of the Maccabees, when the Maccabees had been fighting against the Seleucid overlords, against the Greeks in the land. The Greeks had said, wait a minute, these guys, they rest on the Sabbath. They don't do anything. And so they had waited until the Sabbath. They had attacked them on the Sabbath, and Jews had been killed until the Jews came to the conclusion, it's okay to fight to save my life. It's okay even to kill the enemy if I'm attacked on the Sabbath. And so Jesus asked the question, all right, you've come to the conclusion, and he's not arguing against it, you've come to the conclusion it's okay to protect yourself, to fight if need be, and even to kill on the Sabbath. Having said that, do you think it's okay to do good on the Sabbath? If it's okay to kill, is it also okay to do good? They didn't have an answer for that, so they keep silence. After looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, you see that they're not getting it. They're not getting him. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. An obvious miracle. And the Pharisees are so angry they go out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians. Now that's rather striking, because the Herodians are all about keeping the status quo, keeping the Herods in power, and Herod, he's one of our good old boys. And the Pharisees didn't care for that sort of thing. Pharisees largely were trying to be separate from Herod and from Rome and from Gentiles. But in this case, there's something about mutual enemies that make strange bedfellows. And the Pharisees and the Herodians both did not care for Jesus. And so they begin intriguing, they begin conspiring as to how they might destroy Jesus. Now, in each of these two cases, Jesus has not been saying it's okay to break the Sabbath. What he has been doing is showing a proper keeping of the Sabbath. We can see this when we compare both of these Sabbath incidents, one with the other. In the first incident, it had taken place in a grain field. This one now takes place in a synagogue. The first Sabbath incident, the disciples had been going through. They had picked up grain, they'd eaten it, and that was okay, because they were not working, they weren't reaping the field, they were just grabbing a snack. In the second Sabbath incident, Jesus healed a man with a withered hand, a work of mercy. And again, that was okay. It's okay to do good on the Sabbath. On the first Sabbath incident, a verbal accusation had been made against the disciples. In this second Sabbath incident, no verbal accusation was made, but his accusers were harboring an accusation in their hearts. And Jesus addressed that accusation. And notice, he doesn't say, forget the Sabbath day. He is explaining how it is to be kept. And he can do that because he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Next story. We're going down to Jerusalem. Now, there was in Jerusalem. Notice, John says, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, which indicates it was still standing. By the way, you go there today, and it has been excavated, which means, as a result of these excavations, it's still standing. It's an elaborate pool. It's not a little swimming pool. It has terraces upon terraces and walkways. It is enormous. There is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool which is called in the Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos, 5 porches. And in these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, sick people, and they came here for a specific reason. The story was that there was some water here, and I don't know if the story was true because I wasn't there, but the story is that there was some water here and it would be troubled at times, and it would appear that an angelic visitor would come down and stir up the waters, and the saying was that whoever would get into the water first would be healed. Well, that's the background of the story. But there was a certain man there who'd been 38 years in his sickness, who is no doubt there for exactly that reason. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" Now, that's sort of an obvious question. Sounds almost like a rhetorical question. Of course he wants to get well. And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." He was helpless, and he was even helpless to obtain that which would give him help. He was helpless to get into the water because he's lame. And Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk." His problem, he couldn't even get up and roll into the water. And Jesus says, "Get up, and then pick up your pallet and walk." And immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Here's the problem. Middle of verse 9. It was the Sabbath on that day. And that raises another of these Sabbath controversies. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "Wait a minute, it's the Sabbath. You're not allowed to carry your pallet. What are you doing carrying that thing?" And they hear about it. They come to understand it's Jesus who was the one who had cured him. And for this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father's working until now, and I myself am working." His reason for working on the Sabbath is because he's doing God's work, and God is at work, even on the Sabbath. For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. They were angry with him before. Now they're even more angry. In fact, now they have murder in their hearts because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. They are correct. They get the point. Jesus is making himself equal with God. For this reason, Jesus says, "Moses has given you circumcision." Not because it is from Moses. Moses didn't actually give you circumcision. It came previous to that, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath, Jesus says, "You circumcise a man." You see, they would say, "Wait a minute, we're not supposed to work, but here's the work we're commanded to do." And so it was appropriate that they circumcise somebody on the Sabbath. Verse 23, "If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses will not be broken," the reason they circumcised him was so they could keep the law of Moses. "Are you angry with me because I made an entire man well? You cut a little part of a man off. I make a man whole, an entire man whole, on the Sabbath. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." They're nitpicking instead of judging with a true and righteous judgment. Next, we want to go to a situation we read in Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 through 3. "Now when John, while imprisoned," and that expects a bit of explanation. Matthew just assumes that you know that John the Baptist had been in prison. It's in Mark that we read the extended story of how that took place. He was in prison because he had accused Herod Antipas of taking his brother's wife, and Herod Antipas had been guilty of that. And so John the Baptist had been taken, he had been arrested, and he had been imprisoned. And Josephus tells us the location where this imprisonment had taken place. It is in a location to the east of the Dead Sea called the Macarius Fortress. It's far removed from any other cities. When you go to Macarius, you're only going there. You're not going there on the way to anywhere else. It's a bit like imagining being imprisoned in, like the island of Alcatraz back in the, 1970s and 80s, or on Guantanamo Bay. It's a location when you're imprisoned there, it's very difficult to get to. So here's John the Baptist. He's imprisoned, and he's heard the works of Christ, and he sent word by his disciples and said to him, that is, said to Jesus, here's the message, "Are you the expected one?" Now, John had already been proclaiming Jesus as the expected one. He had been proclaiming that in his preaching at an earlier date, but now he's beginning to wonder, did I get it right? Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else? Maybe I made a mistake. He's beginning to doubt his earlier preaching. What do you do when you doubt? When you've been taking that leap of faith, because faith, I don't think it's a mindless leap, but certainly there's a step of faith, and for sometimes it can feel like a bit of a leap. What do you do when that chasm begins to move and separate, and you find yourself looking down into the doubt? Well, Jesus points to himself. He answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see." And then he describes what they are hearing and seeing, and he puts it into the verbal description of an Old Testament passage. He says, "The blind receive sight, and the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." That's all right out of the book of Isaiah. "And blessed is he who does not take offense at me." You see, that's Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and 6. "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, and the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy." That doesn't say anything about the dead and cry, the dead will be raised, but Jesus was even doing that. He was going beyond the promise. "For waters will break forth in the wilderness." Remember, John, in his imprisonment, is now in the backside of the wilderness. "But waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah," in that desert location. Those words are also echoed in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 6. Remember, part of this is where Jesus had repeated these words in the Gospel of Luke when he had been in Nazareth. "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives." Remember John the Baptist, who's asking these questions. He is a captive. "And freedom to prisoners." Those words would resound with John in his imprisonment. Now, as these men were going away, John has given a message that is meant to take and comfort and encourage John. It will not release him from prison. In fact, he's going to end up dying in prison. He will be beheaded. That hasn't happened yet. And as these men were going away with these words of encouragement, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. And he asked them, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing?" John was none of those things. "Those who wear soft clothing are in king's palaces. But what did you go out to see? What was it about John that attracted you? A prophet? Yes, I tell you. And one who was more than a prophet." John was a prophet, but he was more than that. "This is the one about whom it is written," and now Jesus is going to quote the Old Testament. And the passage that he's quoting is from the very last book to be written in the Old Testament. It is the book of Malachi, where Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, he says, "Behold, I send my messenger." Literally, "Behold, I send Malachi," because the word Malachi means my messenger. "Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you." John, yes, was a prophet, but he was the special promised messenger that would precede the coming of the Lord. Here's the passage, Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. "Behold, I'm going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." We saw that Jesus did exactly that. "And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts." John was that messenger who preceded the coming of the Lord, who announced the coming of the Lord. And he says, "Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist." Why? Because he spans the Testaments. He is a prophet like the Old Testament prophets, and yet he announces the coming of the new covenant. Yet, the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. That's not putting John down. That's saying that the promises of the new covenant that John announced would be even greater still. That is saying that the position that is given to those who are part of the new covenant is greater than anyone in the old covenant ever imagined. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence. And violent men take it by force. And people have wondered, have wrestled with those words. The New International Version, I think, is trying to be interpreted, but I think it's a good interpretation. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing. I like suffers violence. It has been, John, think about it. He was in prison. And forceful men lay hold of it. There's something about the kingdom that has both those who were against it, and they try to pull it down, and it also calls for a certain fortitude to enter it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. That was throughout the entire Old Testament. And if you are willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who is to come. That's referring to the very last two verses of the book of Malachi, which promised that Elijah himself would come. And John fulfills that. He was the one who came in the Elijah costume. And because this is not all that easy to understand, Matthew adds, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Here's the passage in Malachi. Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 says, "Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse." John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah, in the fulfillment of the Elijah prophecy. He came to prepare people for the coming of the Lord, so that there would be believers, so that the land would not suffer the curse, so that there would be blessing instead of cursing. Have you come to him? Have you believed the gospel? Have you believed the one that John foretold? He is the Christ.